Hello, look at this wall. It has quite the view. Although it is the age that is exceptional, for this is the oldest stone construction in all of Central America. For a first attempt of sorts, this wall shows off some remarkable features, not only being made with big blocks of stone fitted together without mortar, they make up some massive platforms, generally called pyramids. Yet it looks nothing like a pyramid. What it does look like is Cyclopean works, as in those to be found in Europe. However, this is Mexico, not Europe, and those locations cannot be related, right? Today's wall is in Central America, in central Mexico, in the region of Morelos, away from the coast. All very central and old. The pedestals were built around 1400 BC at least, making them the oldest monumental structures in the whole region of Mesoamerica, predating all the funky stuff the conquistadors wrecked 3000 years later. So old before that, not even mud bricks were being used, with the locals living in caves and huts. Despite not having a lot of practice in building stuff, what these earliest builders of Mesoamerica accomplished is totally awesome. Massive blocks of stones tightly assembled into some monumental structure, leveling up a whole mountain into sort of an acropolis. Magnificent stuff. It is called the Shimalacatlan pyramids, despite clearly not being a pyramid, and can be better described as a sequence of leveled platforms or a massive pedestal. On the other hand, we do not have a clue what it is either, so between calling it not a pyramid or sort of a pyramid, it does not make a big difference. The main reason we don't know what it is or who built it or even exactly when they did it is because there is absolutely no writing, no carvings, no drawings of any sort in the platforms. These things are completely mute and thus super mysterious. You know that between the South and North Americas, they have this division with football, split about the game being played with their hands or with their feet. What you probably don't know is that in the middle of the two continents, as in Central America, they used to disagree with both ends and played the ball with their hips. Being so obsessed with the sport, they even got Shakira to make a song for it. The hips don't lie ball game is the longest lived ritual in Mesoamerica, trespassing all the major pre-Columbian cultures, as in the peoples living in the area before the World Cup, lasting until the Aztecs, who were the last guys to have played the hip game, since their arrival in Mexico around the 12th century AD until 1520, right before being badly beaten by the Spanish conquistadors, who had no concept of fair play. Before the Aztecs, there were the Maya. Well, there were plenty more people playing, but let's just follow the highlights. The classical Maya lived in the Central America, or in the South Central, or let's call it the jungle area. From about the years 200 to 1000 AD, roughly, enough time to build many cool stuff and destroy the trees and kill plenty of neighbors and a bunch of other hooligan behavior. Plus, of course, the Maya played the hip game relentlessly. A bit before the classical Maya, there was Teotihuacan, famous for the massive pyramids, built in layers from around the beginning of our era until 500 AD. Although there is no stadium left under the Pyramid of the Sun, it seems the whole site was used to play the game, with the audience making graffiti about the sport. Finally, or firstly, and before all that, there were the Olmecs from 1200 BC to 400 BC. Those guys got a big head for good reason. Not only they did play the hip game, they also invented it, being generally regarded as the oldest complete culture in Mesoamerica and the original trendsetters, since most of what the Olmecs invented, as with the local art and myths and games, kept being repeated one way or another by the next man, with all the following cultures in the region following the Olmecs' lead. What is surprising to know is that before the Olmecs, at least by a century or two, Mexico had the builders of the platforms or the pyramid we are visiting today. And that despite having a stadium nearby, the mysterious builders did not play the hip ball game, since the ball court in the site is clearly from a later date, much younger than the platforms, separated by half a millennia or so. The relatively new stadium was built in later Olmec times and, more importantly, is using a cheap style of construction, all made with mortar and small stones. This difference in style of construction is important, as all the Mesoamerican ball courts, likewise all the later temples and pyramids and all the new stuff in the region, they were all built using mortar to glue the stones. This is true for the Olmecs, Aztecs, Maya, and other nameless cultures playing the hip game. The exception alone are the platform builders, who made the oldest construction in the region with a unique, somewhat Cyclopean style. On top of playing hip ball, another thing in common to all the Mesoamerican cultures was the winged snake, the plumed worm, the slim beard, the hairy stick, whatever you want to call it. Quetzalcoatl is the most common name, but that's a later Aztec word. Beforehand, the name changed, and in the case of the Olmecs, we do not have a name for it because the Olmecs, who were the first to register the feather shaft design, had no proper writing. Those who wrote stuff, as in all the other Middle American hip bouncer cultures, also talked about a recurrent myth about a first ever city, a fantastic place named Tollan, built by the feathered serpent after it arrived by boat to civilize the region. If you are surprised by this, I know I was, it is because the early history of the Americas was made a joke and a political weapon by some greedy, arrogant invaders. No, not Cortés. That guy was not pleasant, but could not care less about the myths of the people. The culprits of misrepresentation are academics or scribes who have been using all the rich history of Central America to advance their own petty political agenda, changing opinions as fast as someone pays them to do so, and enforcing the current views as big dogma. Still, what cannot be hidden is the following. The Olmecs are the oldest complete civilization in the region. They carved those African looking big heads and a feathered serpent. Also, the snake bird was later recognized as the founding father of civilization and said to have arrived by boat and or to have built the very first heavenly city of Tollan. Furthermore, there is this incredible stone platform built with a unique style of mortarless big blocks predating any other construction. So, could the platform be Tollan? We will see, But at minimum, Tollan is easier to say than Shimalakatlan. So if you don't mind, I'll start using the shorter name moving forward. Commonly associated with Middle American culture is human sacrifice, chasing around bystanders and slaughtering them. However, this is an exaggeration. Sure, there were plenty of occasions when a crazy ruler with trouble sleeping decided the best way to wake up fresh the next day was to grab some defenseless folks, drag them up a pyramid, and perform heart surgery with a hammer. They claimed it worked, with the sun never failing to rise back on the next day. However, the whole human sacrifice seems excessive, and it is a good thing the conquistadors introduced the alarm clock to make sure people would wake up in a better mood. On the other hand, the new colonial morning routine was not such a big improvement. Because, truth be told, human sacrifice was quite rare in Mesoamerica. Take the Olmecs, those guys that invented the chicken snake and the hip game and carved big heads, as in the first culture around. The Olmecs did not engage in human sacrifice. What they did do to the dead relatives was a bit creepy, but way more reasonable. The Olmecs played around with Grandpa's bones. It is called excarnation or reburial, and it is a funerary ritual that seems strange to us now, involving leaving Grandpa in a temporary spot, allowing nature to eat away the flesh, and then remove the clean bones to display somewhere else. Reburial was one of the favorite death practices for the Olmecs, and the Olmecs alone. Afterwards, the Angover Maya did not practice reburial as the Olmecs had done before, and before everybody else with the hunter-gatherers and small hut villages, who predate the platform in Tollan. These old folks were doing simple burials in fetal position. So where did the bone ritual came from? See, who first played with Grandpa's bones, as in the Olmecs did, were, and take note, the builders of Tolun. Apparently, they introduced not only stone construction, but also the ritual into the continent. And also, on the other side of the Atlantic, at about the same time Tolun was being built as in the Bronze Age, the Cyclopean builders were also into bone play. At about the same time the Tollan platform was being built in the Americas, Europe was in the middle of its finest period, the Bronze Age, or as I like to call it, the Cyclopean times. Cyclopean, at least here, does not mean built by a narrow sighted monster. What I am referring to is a culture, or a family of ancient cultures, known conventionally by different names, such as the Nuragic, Talaiotic, or Castellieri. Groups of people who were great at stone masonry, building large platforms of fitted stones, and also seafaring, plus other quirky traits. This Cyclopean family of cultures is a theory I've been exposing in these videos. But if you do not have the time for it now, just subscribe and consider this. At the same time the Tollan platforms were being built in Mexico, there was extensive bronze trade going around in Europe. Not literally bronze yet, because bronze is made out of two metals, tin and copper, and those were the materials being traded. But literally around Europe, with much of the tin used in the Mediterranean outsourced from Cornwall in the British Islands, taking plenty of boats to go back and forth the Atlantic coast to supply it. Then all it took was for one of those ships to have a bad day at sea, and off they went into the other side of the ocean, landing in Mexico, because if one boat is left adrift in the Atlantic and catches the north equatorial current, the most likely place for it to land is precisely in Mexico. Thus, considering the size of the trade, plus the centuries it lasted, plus all the other fishermen living on the coast, it is even surprising that one-way trips to the Americas did not happen more often. Still, let's try to be like the mainstream and refute the hypothesis of Tollan builders being lost sailors from Europe. Counter argument number one. Why did metal work in the Americas only started at around 600 BC, quite some time after Tollan, when Europe already had plenty of tin trade? Well, let's see. Being a sailor or a fisherman does not require being a blacksmith. And bronze is complicated to make. I could not do it myself. So there's that. Maybe the castaways could not replicate the industry on the other side of the ocean. Now, argument number two against contact is saying the same lack of knowledge in metallurgy also applies into the stonework. Since building large platforms of fitted polygonal stones is not easy, were the sailors any good at it? Answer: no, they weren't. That is probably a good reason for Tollan not exhibiting the fancy polygonal work as we see in Europe. Tollan just looks like someone gave the general idea and the work was done by followers as best as they could. Meaning, the Tollan platforms are a primitive, simpler version of Cyclopean works, as expected from an unskilled immigrant that just landed on site. Okay, and what about number three? If the castaways were not blacksmiths nor expert stonemasons, they were not farmers either. What did they eat? Well, take this answer. American farming predates tall land by millennia, which is a good thing if one is arriving into a new land after crossing the ocean to kickstart a new culture. It is helpful to find the local supermarkets properly stocked. Just ask the pilgrims on the Mayflower. And fourth and final, where are the writings to prove it? Yes, there were no scribes on board, which is expectable. The Tollan builders were illiterate, regardless of which side of the Atlantic they originate. Writing in the Americas only happened after the Olmec, 1,000 years later. And in Europe, the Cyclopean builders, as in the Talayot or the Nuragic, had no writing also. Thus, we have exhausted all the excuses to claim the myth of Tollan was not based on real event coming from Europe. Confused yet? What you should be is suspicious, because all the evidence we have points in one clear direction. The pyramids were the first ever building made in Central America, featuring a Cyclopean-looking acropolis or pedestal, built with large stone blocks, fitted without mortar and no writings nor decoration, just the type of construction that was very common in Europe at the time. Also, the death ritual in Central America following the construction of the platform changed from the simple pits and fetal position to the awkward reburial and bone play, as it was still popular in Europe, also at the time. Plus the extensive sea trade, again at the time, in the European Atlantic coast, made it likely for some folks to be lost at sea. And in that case, at any time, the North Equator current makes Mexico the most likely place to land. Then also, the later cultures in Central America, as in the Aztecs or Maya, had the myth of Tollan, an original city, the birthplace of culture, a city said to have been built by the feathered serpent who arrived on a boat from the east. For me, these facts are enough to consider the Cyclopean influence in Mexico to be very likely. However, the hypothesis of contact across the Atlantic is a taboo for the mainstream, leaving me quite suspicious about why. Here's the thing. The city of Tollan, built by a feathered serpent god, arriving by boat, was a widespread myth in Mesoamerica. The pyramids of Chimalhuacán are the oldest building ever made in the region, and they do look like a lot the stuff done by the Cyclopean builders in Europe. All the people that built both the platforms in Europe and the platforms in Mexico are dead, and their preferred death ritual was excarnation. When they were alive, there was enough Atlantic traffic and sea currents pushing into Mexico, adding up the means, the opportunity, and the big building benefit. Thus, contact across the Atlantic was very likely, and the only reason not to be certain is the same as with anything else in the past. We just don't know what really happened and can only speculate. Likewise, we don't know why the Cyclopean builders made flat top platforms everywhere they landed. Still, that is exactly what we'll try to figure out next. That's it for today. Hope you liked it. Drop an eye in the comments.